Hi, my name is Max Buchanan. I'm the director of the Bike Walk RVA program for sports backers. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and walks and lunch walks. I'm very honored to introduce our next keynote speaker. I've been following Gabe Klein's work in both Washington, D.C. and Chicago, observing with amazement as he transformed those cities in short order. I've seen him speak at the National Bike Summit. I've read his book. I've encouraged several decision makers to read his book. Yesterday, we had a very lively discussion with Mayor LeVar Stoney and some of his staff. Gabe has a reputation for making stuff happen. He's the former director of the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation under Mayor Adrian Fenty, beginning in 2009. During that time, he reinvented the agency with a focus on customer service, technology, and active transportation, including the launch of Capital Bike Share. At the end of Fenty's term, Rahm Emanuel hired Gabe to run the Chicago Department of Transportation and build 100 miles of protected bike lanes, design and build the Chicago River Walk and the Bloomingdale Trail, and launch the largest bike share system in the United States. During the summer of 2016, Gabe Klein and several business partners launched CityFi, a company that advises cities, corporations, foundations, and startups to help understand, navigate, and influence the increasingly complex urban landscape. Gabe, are you ready to come up? Thank you.
I feel like we should be having a dance party in here. It's dark, it's like a club. Max is really well dressed. I'm really excited to be here because I've wanted to come for, I think this is the third year, and I finally made it this year. And thanks to John, Jeff, Max, everybody for sort of their patience. I had a couple kids over the last couple years and put out a book, and time just evaporates when you have kids. I'm sure many of you know that. But anyway, it's great to be back in Richmond. When I was about 10 years old, I moved to about an hour west of here. And so I've been coming to Richmond since the early 80s, and it's great to come back and see all the amazing changes. I also have a number of very close friends that live here and love Richmond. So one thing that Max didn't talk about is I really honed most of my skills in the private sector working in business. And I'm not a planner, I'm not an engineer, I'm just like a dude with a business degree. And I think a lot of my success, if you want to call it success, I'm sure people view it in different ways, but getting things done was because I didn't know any better, because I didn't really understand all the government bureaucracy. I mean, I knew it from the outside, but I just tried to treat government more like a startup, and I worked with big budgets, and I worked for two great mayors that really gave me a lot of rope and let me run really fast as they were also running fast. And I met your new mayor yesterday, and I was super impressed. You know, when Adrian Fenty won election, he was 36. I think Mayor Stoney's 36. I was 36 when I went to he and I were the same age. I was actually a couple years older when I started working for him. But you know, age is nothing but a number, and when a mayor first comes on board, you have this big opportunity to make big directional change in your city. And so I think this is a great time in Richmond, in your history, and it's a great time to try to catalyze this energy to do more even faster. So today I'm gonna talk about a lot of things. I'm gonna try to go through a lot quickly. And I'm gonna talk about, oh, by the way, we started late, so I'm gonna run a few minutes late. I'm going to talk about history, sort of how we got to where we are, because I think a lot of times we forget. And history is very important. To understand history is to understand the future, even though it may look a little bit different. I'm also going to talk about some of the things we're seeing in cities around the world in terms of successes and maybe some failures, what we need to do to make change faster and better, and the technology that's coming and how we might use that to shape the change that we want. I guess I don't need to stand in front of this thing, do I? Because I have this mic. Okay, but before I go into that, I am going to be a little provocative. Just going to warn you, you may not agree with everything I say, I might not even agree with everything I say. But the idea, and like seriously, but the idea is to get people thinking about the change, okay? So let's start out talking about why our work is important. Why are you guys here in this room? Why do you care? Why did Mayor Stoney run for election? I'd like to put the elephant in the room on stage first, because I just like to do that and get it out of the way. Look, this is a very angst-ridden time right now for people in government and for people in the private sector. The private sector likes to be able to predict what's going to happen. And so there is an era of uncertainty. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. There's a lot of change happening, and it's unpredictable. But what we do know is that really for the last 7 years, cities have been on their own. We've had gridlock in Congress, right? And so cities are just maybe more on their own than they were before. But we need to keep on sort of looking out for ourselves in cities, and cities need to work together to make change happen. I love these two pictures. This is Scientific American, almost 100 years apart. We work a lot in this area of smart cities, which reminds me of the term green 5 years ago. Nobody knows exactly what smart cities are, but it's the idea that you're trying to reduce friction and use technology to make people's lives easier. And we've been doing that for hundreds and thousands of years, right? Nothing's changed that much. But what we do need to ask ourselves fundamentally is, what kind of city do we as human beings want to live in? And what kind of infrastructure do we need? And why are our policies not aligned often with the infrastructure and what we ultimately want? I think I'm getting a little echo, guys. I'm not sure if that mic's on or not. So, first big issue, climate change. Nowhere else in the world, by the way, is there any discussion about whether this is real or not. For some reason, it's become a political football in the United States, but I travel all over the world and nobody understands why it is. And it's something that we need to act now on. We did have a discussion last night that got pretty heated. And one of the things I said is, look, it was 37 degrees warmer in the Arctic this November and December than normal. Not 3 or 4 degrees, which is devastating. 37 degrees. That means tsunamis this year in places like Bangladesh. So these scientists continually have to readjust their forecasts because they're too conservative. The planet's warming at a lot faster rate than we think. The other thing that motivates me is the fact that we have kids in particular that are affected by our choices. The number one health problem for kids in cities is chronic asthma caused by air pollution from cars. So there are real impacts from the choices that we make in terms of how we build our cities. And people say, yeah, but government, can they really play a role? I mean, does policy really play a role? Or some people say, well, can the private sector really curb their output? Look, this is a picture of Beijing in 2008, and they're famous for doing this. They just did it a couple weeks ago, where they'll idle the factories, turn off the power plant, right, and tell people they can't drive, to clean the air so that people will come to the Olympics or come to a big summit like they did last week. And so this is the impact of 12 days of a change in policy. It's pretty stark, isn't it? And for the first time since 1980, transportation is the number one CO2 emitter. For the last 37 years, it's been power plants, but no longer the case. Sea level rise is a big issue. I'm working in Charleston right now, and we started to look at the topographical overlay on top of the plan that we're doing, and about 60% of people will be affected by climate change over the next 30 years. 50 years ago, they had 3 days of nuisance flooding, really bad flooding. Now they have 38 days, and the forecast is in 30 years they'll have 180 days. So who knows what the threshold is for a place to not be habitable due to nuisance flooding? 70 days. Okay? So that's why there should be a sense of urgency. And just because in places like Miami Beach, which I love, my grandmother lived there, just because they're building $3 million condos on the beach doesn't mean that we don't have a problem. But we as human beings, the EPA has actually studied this, we have a hard time understanding something this big bearing down on us. Right? So we just ignore it and we shuffle it under the carpet. Even people who have lived through Hurricane Katrina and Sandy now have cognitive dissonance. Not everybody, but many people. and don't remember it. The other thing that motivates me in my work is the health crisis that we have on our roadways. So this is the number of people that die. This is actually from last year, so it's low. This is the number of people that die on the world's roadways. And it's the #1 killer of young people. It's not Zika virus or anything else, it's car death. And when gas is cheap, and we continue to widen our roads and build highways, it just gets worse and worse. I like to say it's like having an obesity problem and just saying, yeah, we'll just build bigger and bigger pants. Buy another belt. You know, that's what we do in America, though. We deal with the symptoms of the symptoms of the symptoms of the problems, and we don't want to deal with the problem. And this is sort of a cultural shift that we need to make in the United States. One other myth that I want to dispel is the fact that the modern city is modern. You know, we think, oh, there's been all these great changes in DC and San Francisco and New York and Montclair, New Jersey. You know what, we've lived like this for tens of thousands of years. The modern city is not necessarily modern. We've built our cities for safety and security, for transportation, for access to food, and we basically have wanted everything within a 5 or 10 minute walk or horse ride, or now bike ride, or transit ride for tens of thousands of years. And they've studied this, and they've learned, like we know that in the modern city of today, that there's a disproportionate increase in productivity the more people that you have living together, the more infill development you have and the more density. Until 2014, we didn't know it was the same thing in ancient societies. So what's happened to us? Well, we've dramatically exploded in population. You know, worldwide, we've gone from 2 billion to 7 billion people in the last 115 years. It's a 350% increase. Now, keep in mind that we have been on the planet for 200,000 years in this approximate form, right? Standing upright. So we are consuming more per capita than we ever have, and the population's exploding. And that's why the Earth is sort of like, enough already, right? We could fit the entire population of the United States into one small state in the middle of the country. But we don't want to do anything that crazy. Let's look at some fun old pictures. So before the automobile came along, people ruled the streets. The streets were not ruled by machines. This is New York City in 1903. This is a picture of Seattle. Politicians didn't used to refer to congestion as a problem. Congestion is something you wanted. You wanted people on your streets, so your stores would be busy. This is my hometown of Washington, D.C. This is what the city looked like on Pennsylvania Avenue when the cars started to be introduced into the system, but it was still a very balanced system. You have people walking, biking. By the way, there weren't crosswalks. You just walked wherever you wanted, which is what Max and I did yesterday, and we survived. And who can guess what city this is? It's not. It's Los Angeles. Downtown Los Angeles. You wouldn't recognize that today. But again, a very balanced system, even with the automobile in the early 1900s. And cycling was an important part of the system. So, who knew that Richmond was the first IEEE electric streetcar system in the United States? It's pretty awesome. So, you guys have a history of setting trends. Not necessarily following, but setting trends. I mean, this was a big, big deal, and you had a very advanced system. But, you know, like every city in America, GM bought up a lot of the systems with Firestone and Standard Oil and shut it down. And they were celebrating it. They're like, look, there's a new technology, and we're gonna move to trackless trolleys, which sounds great, except people didn't like it as much. And that's the remnants of what we had. And they actually celebrated by burning the trolleys, like the public burning of the transportation system in Richmond in 1949. So that's sort of the history of the streetcar, the very abbreviated version. Let's talk about biking. Biking was a primary form of transportation around the turn of the century. You guys had your bicycle squad. This is how the police got around. This happens to be a Jewish community here in Richmond. Everybody rode their bikes, and even ladies were invited to suit up and ride a bike. Even ladies could ride a bike. So, we tend to think of the bike in this country as a recreational form. Well, it's a form of recreation. It's the number 2 after fishing form of recreation in the country. It's an $82 billion industry. A bunch of that is bicycle tourism, which I'm sure you guys get a piece of. So to give you a sense of how big that is, the airline industry is $52 billion. So if we can get people to start thinking about biking, which they already love, as something that they use for utility and for transportation, we can go a long way. 70% of trips less than a mile in cities in the United States are taken by car. And we have the biggest obesity problem in the United States. So we just got to recalibrate a little bit. Now, fast forward a bit, 1956, Federal Highway Act, $25 billion massive program. It was the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. There's always a little defense in there to justify the spending of the money. But it was a huge project, and it was admirable. We wanted to facilitate interstate commerce. We wanted Americans to be able to go from state to state and from city to city. But we thought, hey, this is going so well. This is an opportunity to socially re-engineer our cities and put people back to work post-war. So we drove highways right through our cities. We tore the heart and soul out of many of our cities. We segregated our cities. And then we sent people out to the suburbs to live. We built them these 750 square foot tract houses. And GM and others got together and sold people this American dream really aggressively. And I work with Bill Ford at Fontanalis Partners. I also do venture capital work, and Bill Ford will tell you that the single occupancy vehicle is not the future of the car industry, which is why they're putting billions of dollars into mobility and artificial intelligence and various other things. So what happened? Well, we started selling people more depreciating assets than appreciating assets, for one thing. And as we did this, there was a direct correlation between the purchasing of single occupancy vehicles and road death. And there was a big backlash. Even President Truman came out against the evil automobile. But the automobile won. And the streetcars suddenly became slow. They used to be very efficient, but they were stuck behind the cars. So then they were just as slow as a car, and it didn't seem to make sense anymore. So as we moved everybody out to the suburbs, by the way, not everybody benefited equally. And in a place like Detroit, where I spend a lot of time, we drove I-7 right through Paradise Valley, Black Bottom, which is a African-American neighborhood. 120,000 African-Americans came from the South to get opportunities in the North, mostly in the auto industry. And then we basically destroyed the neighborhood, and we took out 350 black-owned businesses and built a stadium and highways. And at the same time we were doing that, and this happened in city after city, but it's very dramatic in Detroit. At the same time, we shut down the streetcars. So the streetcars went away. So what do you think happened? People left. Like, we sent people a really clear message. We said, we're making your neighborhood uninhabitable, and we're taking away your transportation system. So what do you think people did? They fled. People with means fled. And cities cratered in terms of population. So let's talk about parking, because I love looking at parking. I've been taking pictures of parking ever since I got here. I don't want to be negative. It's a huge opportunity. You guys have 40% of your downtown is parking. But that's a huge opportunity because you can repurpose that space. So the history of parking, parking as passed by Congress in 1972 for Washington, D.C. was the space allocated to park space. It was called parking. And D.C. was supposed to take 50% of their street space and allocate it to parking. But people started tying up their horses and then putting their cars in between the trees, and at a certain point, it got so crazy they just removed the trees and left the cars. And that's how parking came to be. And then we just started dedicating inordinate amounts of space to parking. And so now we have this. Who knows how many parking spaces we have in America? Nobody. Seriously, the conservative estimates are 500 million, and the estimates go up to 2 billion. We don't have any idea. But here's the impact on people like you and me, and people outside this room. So the average 2-bedroom in the US is $800 a month. When you add an underground parking space, it goes to $1,300 a month. It's a 62.5% increase. Now, if somebody uses transit and bikes and walks, it's about $150 a month on average. So you go from $800 to $950. In this situation, where you're telling people, go buy a car, and they go spend another $900, and you probably aren't putting enough money into transit, so they really need to buy a car, then you go to $2,300. So we need to decouple the cost of transportation and housing to understand what we're really doing. And what we're really doing is creating an affordability crisis in our cities with cars and parking. It's that simple. Meanwhile, we have this problem. And a quarter of the homeless population, by the way, are little girls like this girl in LA. So, what kind of society do we want to be? And we've gotten so focused on machines and the storage of machines and moving by machine that we've lost track of people in the process. And now we have this. This is our high quality of life in America that we love and we don't want to give up. So we have an opportunity to embrace a new quality of life. These are just some pictures I took. God, that's dark. Okay. I was taking a beautiful run this morning, and there was this sort of cool looking building, and I looked closer and closer and closer, and I'm like, that's a parking garage. So you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig, even next to beautiful green grass. And this was a photo I took on Cary Street. And I realized, I was on the 5th block, and I realized it is all parking. Every building, ground floor, parking for 5 blocks. And the street's dead. Of course it's dead, right? And then I crossed the street, because I'm like, I want to be on a livelier side of the street, but there's no sidewalk. I mean, there is a sidewalk for trees. So if you're a tree, you got it good. And the irony, I was telling Max, I was looking at this picture and I'm like, they have so much excess space, they could move the cars 8 feet in and create a 16 or a 14-foot sidewalk. But nobody's done it, because we're just used to it. We're used to the status quo. Okay, who's depressed? All right, well, let's talk about, it gets better. Let's talk about what's happening now in cities. And by the way, I'm gonna talk about big cities, small cities. This happens to be Hachiko Square in Tokyo. Up there, you've got the busiest Starbucks in the entire world. Because at peak, 2,300 people cross this intersection on one red light. And half of them go to this Starbucks, the other half go to the one downstairs. I couldn't even get in there today. But seriously, congestion is a good thing here. Let's look at Shanghai, because people are interested in these mega cities. How did they come to be? How are there 24 million people in Shanghai? So in the time that we would take to figure out if we want to do BRT, or do we want to fix our metro system in DC, or all these questions, they've built an entire city in Shanghai. And not just vertically, they've built all the transportation infrastructure to serve these people. So there's rail under the water. They have 329 metro stations I'll talk about in a second. But when I landed there, they're like, well, how do you want to get to the city? You can take a car and it's like $80 and it takes an hour, or you can take the maglev and it's $5 and it gets there in 8 minutes at like 300 miles an hour or something. I'll take the maglev. Here, transit's like the last resort. It's like a social program. If you don't have any money, you're really hard up, okay, you might have to take the bus, right? That's not how they view transit in other places. So I was there in June speaking, and I met a bunch of the government officials. And I'm like, wow, you guys in 25 years have built 329 metro stations. And they said, yeah. And I said, okay, with all this technology coming, what's your plan? Are you going to just do autonomous cars? I'm like, no. I mean, we're going to do autonomous cars, but we're going to build another 320 metro stations over the next decade. 650 they're going to, because a developer won't even consider building a building if it's not near a metro stop. So in 30 years, it's become a part of their culture. So I would ask you, when we think about transit, is transit more important in terms of moving large groups of people, or is it more important in terms of creating these nodes where people want to live? I think it's about creating the nodes where people want to live, putting the school there, the doctor's office, the hospital, the restaurant, the bar, the grocery store. And then when people do have to move, they can get on the train. But in the future, we may be moving less, and we'll talk more about that later. So big picture, if you look at history to now, we've gone from this period of hyper-consumption where we just wanted to own everything. White picket fence, 2 cars, swimming pool, 18 televisions, 36 bags of pork rinds, whatever it was, we wanted to own as much stuff as possible, stuff it in our basement. I'm from that generation a bit. I'm like a bit of a hoarder. I had to build a garage just to keep all my crap in that I don't use. Younger people don't feel that way. Now, part of it is that culturally they're different. They're more experiential. They're more interested in experiencing life versus owning a bunch of stuff that they don't use. But also, they have $100,000 worth of debt on average if they go to college coming out, and maybe they don't have the money either. And we recognized that back in the early days of Zipcar. Even though gas was $1.28 a gallon, we knew that cities were going to get more expensive. We knew that people wanted to drive less. We had started to see a decrease, even though the population was growing, we saw a decrease in people getting driver's licenses. And we partnered with the government, and a lot of what I write about in my book is innovation in public-private partnerships, and how there's a whole continuum. If we hadn't partnered with government to put cars on the street and really become an extension of the public transit system, we probably never would have hit profitability. We probably never would have been able to go public, and all of that stuff, right? So this is really, really crucial. And government has a lot of opportunity right now to leverage the private sector. This happens to be Montreal. But a lot of transit agencies are saying, like, wait, do I want to run all the trains and buses? Do I want to be focused on labor agreements and, how to raise my next dollar? Or do I want to be focused on aggregating all the public and private services, maybe contracting out the bus and the rail to an operator and focus on the whole ecosystem, from cradle to grave, from somebody's house to stopping at Tim Hortons and getting a discount on coffee, which is what they do, to getting people to work and curating their entire day. So the idea of transit is evolving, and God, we got to make it easy for people to pay for it. If we can't figure that out, then we got huge problems, right? We shouldn't have to have a special card and all this stuff to pay for it. And transit agencies are also saying, wait, with this whole idea of sharing and the sharing economy, maybe we can lower our costs and leverage some of these private services and give people more equitable access. Like, is it equitable to provide people a bus every hour through their neighborhood to get them to their hourly job? And if they miss it, they're screwed. Or should we be giving them on-demand transportation to the light rail or to the BRT that's more reliable? And with this idea of sharing, it's not just about services, it's about space. So this is an old picture of Pennsylvania Avenue. This is the streetcar. It's actually the last streetcar that ran in DC before they shut it down in 1962. And we used to share the public space. Then it became car space and like a parking lot for Secret Service down the middle. I mean, that's all that was there. So I asked the mayor if I could take that space and reallocate it and try to make it a complete street again. And the mayor said, yeah, just don't screw it up, because it's a sensitive street. It's like our Champs-Élysées. So I proceeded to completely screw it up, the whole project, which I talk about in the book. And he was such a great mayor, though, he had my back. And he gave us enough rope that he wanted us to make mistakes. He wanted us to try and fail and get up and fix it. And we're able to do that, and it became a huge success. And when we finally opened it, the Secretary of Transportation came out, Congress people came out, and now people love it. And it's full of people riding of all ages, sizes, and abilities every day. And we didn't just put bike lanes in place in DC and Chicago. We also launched big bike share systems so that nobody had to make a capital investment in their transportation anymore. Whether it was using Zipcar or Car2Go or bike share, you no longer had to buy a car, and we made it very public and we marketed the hell out of it. And so it's not enough to just build bike lanes, it's not enough to do bike share. You can do both, and you can do one before the other at the same time. The important thing is to get started and get stuff done. And people will finally wake up and they'll say, wait a second, do you mean I don't need to go to the gym? Like, I was in the Netherlands for about 8 or 9 days a few years ago. I didn't see a gym the entire time. Everybody looks like a rock star over there. They're all a foot taller than Max and I, though. That's part of it. But they understand that if they just ride their bike for 2/3 of their trips, the fat just evaporates, and they can basically eat whatever they want. They eat pretty well, too. But this is what we do. Now, I don't fault this person, though, because look at the situation. There's no sidewalks. And in her frame of reference, or his frame of reference, this is normal behavior. This is what we do in America in our suburbs. And this is how we exercise. Right? We get a babysitter, we drive to the fitness place, we take the escalator down, we run for 20 minutes, and we race back to our house to let the babysitter off. I mean, it's when you talk to people from other places, they're like, that sounds crazy. right? But we think it's normal. So when I was born, the majority of people walked and biked to school, and now it's the opposite, right? And people get driven. So the average 15-year-old is 15 pounds heavier now, and the average adult is 24 pounds heavier than they were. And it's not that Coca-Cola and McDonald's don't have some role, but a sedentary lifestyle is the number one problem. Meanwhile, life expectancy is going down for middle-aged white people in the US, while it's going up in most other countries. Our healthcare, by the way, is double the cost of any other industrialized nation. I wonder why. Maybe we're dealing with the symptoms of the problem instead of the problem. So what we tried to do, people think, oh, transportation, that's how I get from here to there. And we said, no, because you actually don't care about that too much. It's about everything else. It's about your quality of life. And the pedestrian is the indicator species of a healthy place, of a healthy city, economically, from an actual health standpoint, socially, public safety-wise. And now we've got data and we've studied this, and we know that when you create a place that people want to be, they go there, and they spend their money, and they buy a condo or a house, they raise their kids, because they feel safer there. Why do people move to the suburbs? Lots of reasons, but they wanted that cul-de-sac and their kids could play, right, in their own space. You can create those spaces right in the city. So let's talk about induced demand, because I go all over the country and people say, yeah, we got a congestion problem, so we got to add another lane to the roadway. Well, you can't do that in a city anyway, right? So they do it on the highway. And then the city streets, as Tim Keene says, the director of planning for Atlanta, he's like, my whole downtown feels like on-ramps to the expressways, right? And so here's what they did on Market Street in San Francisco. I was in the guy who runs SFMT, I was in his office, and it's 8:30 in the morning, that's rush hour. And I said, well, where is everybody? He's like, they're either on the train, like on the trams, on the bus, biking. There's nobody driving. He said, well, there's only 2 lanes with a 10-mile-per-hour speed limit. You'd be stupid to drive on this street. Right, so we think, well, we got a congestion problem, add more capacity. He thinks we have a congestion problem, let's get rid of the lanes. It's a completely different approach. It's counterintuitive, and it works. And what the data shows is that when you expand the roadways, you fix the problem for 2 months. And after 2 months, the problem is worse than it was before. Why? Because we're just, I like to say we're fancy animals. We're lemmings. We do what we're told, and we're telling people, go get in your car. And then people do, and they go buy a car, and they drive, and then they can't get anywhere. And you see it over and over the other way as well. In Paris, they close the roads every year for the beach that they do on the Seine. And last year they said, hey, let's just not reopen the roads and see what happens. And it was more congested for 2 months. And then the congestion went away because people made other choices. So people might be lemmings in that they want to be told what to do and they take visual cues, but they're not stupid. People are capable of making other choices. So when we were building our bike facilities in Chicago, I knew we had to have our downtown connection. That was going to be hard, taking lanes in the downtown. But we looked at the roadway and we realized it was not optimized at all. We had a bus lane that was just, like basically FedEx trucks were parked there all the time. The signalization was bad. There were no turn signals. And so we put in a 2-way bike facility, but we added sensors to trigger the signals for the bikes and the cars. We didn't even do anything with the bus lane, but paint it. It was still obstructed. But we were able to lose a lane and not affect throughput of traffic. And part of it is induced demand, and that you're operating in a system. And then part of it is that the lanes were so badly laid out and signalized. So by applying some technology, you can address those problems and give people another option. And so I show this GIF a lot because you don't need to be a traffic engineer to understand this stuff, right? It's pretty simple. It's volumetrics is all it is. And you can only get so many people in individual cars through a space. And it doesn't matter how fast you're going. You go as fast as you want. Every block, there's a stoplight or a stop sign. So it doesn't matter how fast you go. You need organized throughput of people in high capacity vehicles or very small vehicles, bikes or walking. So finally, people are starting to understand this, and we're starting to see a backlash, just starting to see a backlash against unnecessary highways, which I call stimulus spending, right? And there's a big difference. Like, you can invest in your future or you can spend on stuff. There's not necessarily any correlation. It's all about return on investment. The return on investment from building a highway is typically negative, particularly if you look at the real estate values, which go down dramatically. In Tampa, they're trying to spend $9.3 billion to expand the Tampa Bay Expressway again. And the data they collected to say that they need to do it, they collected while it's still undergoing the last 8-year expansion. It's just a stimulus project. It has no benefit for traffic and no return on investment for real estate. And they're going to take out 140 homes and businesses to do it. It's crazy. But they think it's normal. And if you go a step beyond just the return on investment and the cost benefit, to actually ask yourself, what's the total cost or benefit to society, looking at environmental impacts, health impacts, which again ties back to like our cost of healthcare and all of that stuff, then you realize, wow, if you build walking and biking infrastructure, you actually can make money off of it. It's profitable. We think that the bus is a sinkhole, or the train, because you got to pay operating costs. No. If you really look at it accurately, it costs 6 times to build and operate car infrastructure than it does bus and train infrastructure. And even little investments like bike share can be very, very impactful. We've seen up to 18% increases in business around bike share stations in Washington, D.C. We've also seen increases in mental health for homeless people that we gave memberships to, because they're out being active and they have a way to get around. But we continue to spend like 94% of our money on roads and highways. And by the way, we can't even maintain what we've got. As an example, I was in Charleston last week, and I get there and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try to take this bus to West Ashley. So it was a 10-minute Lyft ride, or it was 11 hours and 45 minutes on the bus. Now, I had to wait 10 hours to get the bus, and it was an hour and 45 minutes. But I mean, what do you think people are gonna do? And they were like, oh, people don't wanna ride the bus. Or they say, well, people don't wanna ride their bike from West Ashley across to the center of the city, to the peninsula. Of course not. There's a bridge with no bike lanes where the cars are doing 70 miles an hour. You'd be suicidal. So we don't give people choices. And we also don't connect to the land use. So we don't understand that, like, in Hong Kong or Singapore, actually in Hong Kong, the transit system's hugely profitable. It generates a ton of revenue because the land development company is the transit company. And just like the streetcars from the turn of the last century in America, they build the train and the development around it, and they capitalize on that, and they fund the operations of the train. And you are starting to see this in the US, at least that they understand the connection. So in Phoenix, which is, by the way, not a liberal place, it's a relatively conservative place, they built an initial light rail, I believe from the airport, and they saw a huge return on investment, to the point where the conservatives got behind it, because they said, wait a second, the ROI here is huge. They taxed themselves to the tune of $31.2 billion to build a citywide light rail. And they're seeing huge impact. So you gotta relate the real estate and the land use and quality of life. Or in Florida, when Rick Scott turned back the money for the high-speed rail, which I thought was sort of dumb, but it may have been smart, because the private sector said, wait a second, we can do this ourselves, and stepped up, and they built it in like 3 years. It's gonna start operating this summer, and guess what? They don't wanna make any money from it. They'd love to just break even on the high-speed rail. They're making all their money off the real estate. So the developers are a very important part of this conversation. And they're very smart, by the way. And they're starting to understand the economics of walking and biking more than even most mayors. Let's look at a place like Barcelona, where they've done the math and they said, wait a second, if we just took these like 4x4 block neighborhood areas, and we said to people, we're gonna do a 2-phase experiment here, where we're going to only allow right turns first. And then once people get used to that, we're just gonna cut the neighborhood off to traffic altogether, unless you live there or you need a delivery or something. And they're doing it. They're implementing it, and they think they can cut 60% of the traffic out. And think about it. Most people are gonna be picked up and dropped off in the future anyway, which we'll talk about. People are not owning cars in cities like they used to. 88% of people in DC that are moving there do not bring or buy a car. And we don't even have autonomous vehicles. There's so many other options. So if you can't walk 2 blocks then we got other problems that we got to deal with. And that's ultimately what you're asking people to do, is to walk 2 blocks, to eliminate traffic in their neighborhood and make basically the entire neighborhood play space for their kids. That's awesome. So, how do we get where we need to go? From there to here. Well, fundamentally, we got to redesign around people. We've got to focus on the pedestrian first. We have to embrace transit-oriented development, which has been working for thousands of years. It's nothing new. The form of transit may have changed, but otherwise it is not. We have to recognize that the roadway in an urban environment is different from a suburban environment, and we need to allocate space. You can tell a lot about a city or a society by how they allocate their space and their budget, and we have to do it differently in an urban context. And now there are guidelines from NACTO. I sit on the advisory board of NACTO, and they've put together great design guidelines endorsed by federal DOT so that you don't have to build to a suburban standard in an urban environment. And that goes for suburbs that want to convert to cities, by the way, which you see all over the place. And there's been this movement towards quick builds, to saying, wait a second, let's try this first. Let's show it to people. Most people need to see something to buy into it. Let's see if they like it. Let's get their feedback. Let's tweak it and change it. And then let's make the gold-plated version permanent, like they did in Calgary, where in less than a year, they built an entire protected bike lane network. Isn't that amazing? For less than, I think, $7.2 million. You can do it. It just takes getting it done and getting people excited about it. So if you are running an agency, if you work in government, our goals, like for transportation, used to be pretty simple, and they're admirable. Throughput, safety, right? But what people actually care about, and the outputs of the choices we make, are all of these things. They care more about these things. Transportation ranks 23rd in importance when people vote, but they care about these outcomes. And so in DC and Chicago, we put together very aggressive 2-year plans. Everybody's got a 30, 40, 50-year plan. Not everybody, but a lot of cities do. I found it was much more important to hold people accountable for 24 months. And that's how we got so much done. So we basically took a startup approach to management. We would allow some pivoting. And we built the plans around the things that people cared about. And then, using very basic management, which very few people actually use, we use SMART goals. Specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, time-based goals. And it starts to become a culture in your business or your agency in terms of how you communicate. And we put people's names next to tasks. So we told them, if you don't complete it, that's fine, but you're gonna be publicly humiliated when the next document comes out, versus publicly celebrated. Then we put together our sub-plans, Streets for Cycling, which called for 645 miles of facilities, next generation facility, a high quality facility within a quarter mile of every Chicagoan. We wanted to address it for everybody, not just the young 22-year-old white guy on the fixed gear bike. And then we stuck to a schedule with no budget, by the way, and we were creative and figured out how to build this network. And we had a pedestrian plan. We've been walking around on our own 2 feet for 200,000 years. That's our basic form of transportation. We started to reprioritize strategic, tactical, urbanist interventions to make people's neighborhoods safer for a couple $1,000s. And then we can make it permanent later. We put in speed cameras, and we use the revenues to fix all the problems around our schools. And we brought back ideas from the 1940s and 50s, like the barn stance, which they still have in Tokyo, which they stole from us, but we got rid of. So for intersections that have more pedestrians than cars, why not give the pedestrians the priority? And we ask questions like, why do we allow delivery trucks at rush hour to double park all over the city and then wonder why traffic's congested? And I was able to ask those questions because I had no traffic engineering background. I was just like, this seems stupid. And people were like, yeah, it is stupid. And we put our complete streets guidelines in place and said that every street that we build, unless it's like a hardcore industrial street, has to accommodate all users. And then we didn't just put together pretty drawings, we actually built the streets. And we had to institutionalize it in our agency, but in the other agencies, and with the developers. We rejiggered our budget to the tune of $1 billion over 7 years, and we started putting back transit stations that had disappeared. and saw huge investments around them, revamping old transit stations that were falling down. And we had a lot of very cheap tactical interventions, just allowing the private sector to activate alleys and fix them up. We had big public space projects like the Bloomingdale Trail, which Rahm Emanuel tossed to me and said, okay, go figure it out. I ran on this, now go build it. And I want to be able to ride my bike on it from end to end within 4 years. We had no budget. And we worked with the Trust for Public Land, the county, the state, the private sector. We begged, borrowed, and stole, and we took this old abandoned rail line and made it into a beautiful active use biking, running trail, which is now under use. We had to get 500 easements. We had to move a train station. We had to fix 37 bridges that were falling down, and we did it. And we did it because the mayor set a goal. And then he said, do it or you're fired. And we figured out how to do it. So that's important. But now people are enjoying it, and it makes it all worthwhile. We did the same thing with the Riverwalk, which wasn't even an agenda item when I came to Chicago, but we knew it sucked. You could tell it sucked when you went there because there were $10 beers above, and then there were dollar beers on the Riverwalk. So we knew there was a problem. Now, some people are still mad at me because they liked the dollar beers on the Riverwalk. Now it's $13 for a glass of wine. But we said, okay, it's not contiguous, like little kids can't get down there, disabled people can't get down there. We put together a conceptual design. We got a $99 million loan from the federal government, from the TIFIA program, over 8 months. It's the fastest one they'd ever done. And we went to construction. We concurrently did the engineering for the project. And guess what? We talked to the private sector. We talked to the people who ran the tour boats. We talked to the people that wanted to put retail down there that had little dollar beer stands. And they said, you know, if you make it beautiful, we're willing to pay 3 times what we pay now for that space. And they did. And they pay the note on the loan, and the city's making a profit. Meanwhile, the citizens have an amenity that they love. And there's even Chicago public school classrooms going in on the Riverwalk. So this is an example of a win-win-win. Nobody loses. And if you do a project really well, nobody should lose. There should never be losers. When we look at our streets, there are 2 types of streets. There are local streets, like this, and then there are big arterial streets. On the local street, we want to put everybody together at a very slow speed on the street. And on a big arterial street, you want to segregate traffic because it's unsafe at higher speeds with big 12,000-pound buses and so on. And this is nothing new. We stole these ideas from Europe, where they made all the mistakes we did, but for 40 years, they've been fixing it, and now they have pedestrian bike priority streets. All the local streets really are. And if you live in a suburb, do not give up hope. Suburbs are reinventing themselves as cities all over the country. Arlington, Virginia is right outside of DC. When I moved to DC, it was a bunch of empty lots. And now they have more downtown office space than Denver or Dallas. And they've cut their congestion by 15 to 30% on every arterial. You should read this article, by the way, about Arlington and how they did it. And not everybody wants to live in a huge city. Richmond's beautiful, and it's a great scale. You know, this is Montclair, New Jersey. I think it's 37,000 people, but it's got everything that a big city has at a very small scale, which is wonderful. And they've done the same interventions, and they fixed their streets. But to do this, we need everybody. We need the activists, we need the advocacy organizations, we need the public sector, the private sector, the developers. We need everybody to work together to do this. And there are great models out there for transit, like Hong Kong. The government, the old government, was starting to facilitate these public-private partnerships with the smart city grants. Hopefully that'll continue. And cities are making investments in creating these transportation mobility ecosystems with virtual platforms and physical platforms in the city. Okay, I'm going to talk very quickly about what's coming. And I'm not too far behind because we started like 1:44 is when I got up here, according to this clock. So, people were not ready a year ago. A lot's changed. Cities are much more aware of what's coming. Tesla said they're going to have a car that can drive from LA to New York by the end of this year, I think we were talking about, on its own. Elon was saying, you can be in your apartment in New York, and you just hit one button and it'll drive from LA. I was like, that is a horrible idea. But anyway. But people ask me, like, when are these cars coming? Are they coming soon? And I'm like, oh, yeah. I'm like, have you ever seen a Tesla on the highway? You should look over at the person driving and see what they're doing. In this case, asleep on the 405 going to work. So we already have autonomous vehicles. We have level 2, 3 autonomous vehicles. But what we're getting is autonomy level 4 and 5. We're invested in this company, Nutonomy, out of Cambridge. They do most of their business in Singapore. They've already launched robotaxi service in Singapore. So you can get picked up by an autonomous vehicle. Actually, in Pittsburgh, you can as well. There's a human in it, monitoring. And what you see is this two sides of the same coin. So you have Lyft and Uber on one side of the coin, and that business model, and then you have autonomous vehicles, and everything becomes a robotaxi, whether it's Zipcar, Car2Go, or Lyft, or maybe even General Motors. Everything in an urban environment becomes a robotaxi. So it's a great commodification of point-to-point transportation. Now, there are opportunities there. If the city controls the platform, you can start incenting people to walk or bike or take the robotaxi. You can tax the first mile of the robotaxi so that people want to go walk or bike. There's a lot of things that are going to change, and there are a lot of opportunities to incent people for the right behaviors. But one of the things that's really important is to think about how it'll cut car ownership dramatically. This is in Henrico County, Short Pump. In downtowns, you're talking about cutting 95% of the car ownership. That's huge. And then the correlation to traffic death, and this is over 10 or 15 years, but it's pretty exciting what we could see. But we have to get this right. And when you think about it, it's not just autonomy, although that's important in automation, it's connectivity. It's the ability for vehicles to talk to each other, and every vehicle to become a transit vehicle. And you'll have different envelopes. You'll have the little tiny pedal electric 2-person vehicle, and you'll have the 54-seat bus, right? And you'll have everything in between, but they'll function a lot alike. And developers are waking up and saying, wait a second, Carey Street, that should be a people street. I'm gonna make $500 million on that. And they're buying up parking garages. And I think cities should play a role in that, and ideally they would stay invested, because the gas tax is going away. And we're way underinvested in our infrastructure. And cities need new revenue streams. So we gotta think about that. And when we build those new condos on Carey Street, who are we gonna house in them? Is it just gonna be rich people? Or are we gonna give everybody housing? It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reallocate 40% of your cities. And our streets can look different. So this is a typical street today with 8 lanes. By the way, you guys have a ton of one-way pairs. There's an opportunity to change them back into neighborhood streets. It feels like a highway out there, and you're scared to cross the street. In this situation, you feel safe again. So we can really dramatically change our streets under the guise of technology. Perkins and Will did this drawing of 40th Avenue in San Francisco, what it could look like in the future. I love there's one broken down Chevette left on the street, that's it. But it could be a utopian sort of idyllic outcome where we have a win-win-win for everybody. Low-income people, families, people aging in place, kids, or it could be a dystopic outcome where we sprawl even further. And we have less equity than we do now. So in my book, I lay out how we can create this autonomous, shared, connected, multimodal future where we use the right tool for the right problem, where everything doesn't become de facto robotaxi, right? Where we walk and bike for trips less than 2 or 3 miles. And you look at the European cities, I mean, the autonomous car, it's important, they're gonna have autonomous buses, but they're not really thinking about autonomous cars in a lot of their center cities because they're starting to get rid of cars in the center city, right? Because their culture's different. And when people say things like this, I think, yeah, that's probably true. I think there will be a lot of cities when families realize that the computer is so much better and will not put their kids at risk or them at risk. And my 8-year-old, when she does turn 8 in 5 years, could maybe walk or bike to school on her own without me. That's pretty amazing. I think you will see human-driven cars outlawed. This is I just pulled this off the internet last week. Investors are now saying, no, I think the future's in bikes. They're back to like 1898. Everything's cyclical, right? And the envelopes are going to look very different. They think bike sharing, bikes of varying types are going to be the next big thing. And they're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars, actually, of investment into bikes again. But it's not about autonomous cars. It's about the technology. This is a 12-person shuttle. It's smaller than my Volvo wagon. So don't get too caught up in the car aspect of it. And when you think about how long it'll take, you know, was it 1897 you guys launched the electric streetcar? And by, was it 1898 or 99? There were like 900 electric streetcar systems. And by 1906, the horse was gone. It was relegated to the farm. So this stuff can happen very, very quickly, just like Uber did. So big picture, it comes down to change management. That's really the big thing that we're gonna have to deal with. The job losses, the cultural shifts, are we gonna build more parking garages, are we gonna build space for people, all of those questions. And the automation is a big thing. You know, automation is gonna change, it's already changed everything. This last election was about automation. And the next one will be too, and the one after that will definitely be about automation. And the way that we build things. We may be crowdsourcing plans for vehicles and then building them in people's neighborhoods. We're starting to use 3D printing to print things like phones, to print buildings in Denmark and in Dubai. We're already seeing the impact of e-commerce, right? This will be the biggest year for store closings in history. And it's before 3D printing really takes hold, when you can print stuff in your house. And Amazon, they have half the e-commerce. It's amazing. One website. You can even go there. I was on there last week. You can buy your going out of business retail banner for your store on their website. And probably just go work at Amazon. Companies like New Balance are experimenting with maker stores, so you can go in and they'll print you a pair of shoes in the store. So there are some upsides too, like we could lose a lot of our street level retail, but it could be that that street level retail becomes manufacturing, where you go and you actually get your manufactured products. So instead of getting shoes from Vietnam or China, you get them made in America. Adidas announced they're gonna be bringing manufacturing back to Germany, and they're opening their first US plant ever. And I was like, that's awesome, I love US made shoes. Guess how many people are gonna be working in the factory making the shoes? 0. No people. It's all machines. So, something to think about. Housing's gonna change. Again, younger people, they want simplicity. The ability, this company, Casita in Austin, is selling you a house once, and they'll build places all over the country, and you can just take the house with you. They'll throw it on a truck. So you could buy one house for your entire life, and it's just like IKEA. It's just snap and click. But the biggest change is going to be free energy. We've been subsidizing companies like ExxonMobil forever. $18 billion in tax breaks last year. So when we stop that, and you know, there's more VC money now going into renewables than traditional fossil fuels now anyway. So this is going to be a big shift. It'll change the economics of everything, including transportation. And the big elephant in the room, what are we all going to do? I don't know. The Economist and McKinsey studied this, and they said that the growing use and sophistication of automation will shift the emphasis of human employment towards creativity and social skills. So all this emphasis on STEM, we're talking at lunch, like, I don't want my kids to have any homework, and I want them to go play outside. And they're trying to train them to become computer programmers, and those jobs are already going away, and they're going to be gone in 10 years, the majority of them. In the next decade and a half, digital technology will dissolve the concept of work as we know it. So why does this matter in this conversation? By the way, this is one of those things I'm not subscribing to and saying it's definitely going to happen this way, but some really smart people are saying this. Although McKinsey also said by the year 2000, 100,000 people would use cell phones, and they were wrong about that. So who knows? But coming back to the simple stuff, what kind of city do we want to live in? If you're not working anymore, you're working 80% less time, you're working out of your house, where do you want to live? Do you want to live on a highway in a dark, gray place? Or do you want to live in a beautiful place? And it's amazing. You walk, like Cary Street's sort of dark and gray, and you walk over here to the James River, and it's absolutely beautiful. So we need to combine that more. And what kind of society ultimately do we want to be? We have to ask ourselves that question. When it comes to things like parking, I've done the math on this. Parking is a losing proposition. And what if we were to prioritize people? We could provide people with housing for less than $358 a month at current interest rates. And by the way, a micro unit is 330 square feet on average. Guess how big a parking space is? 330 square feet. So what if we stopped storing cars and started storing people? We could take 0.05% of our current parking and have all those homeless people have a place to live. And you're starting to see the shift. The irony of this picture, this is in Indy, they built micro units. They took a lane of traffic. Now the irony is they bolted it onto a parking garage. Eventually the parking garage will be repurposed, I'm sure. And then vertical farming is going to change everything too. The ability to use parking garages, for instance. In this case, they built onto the parking garage to create food, a lot of food. Or in places like Dallas, they said, hey, what if we just decked over this highway? Real estate values went from the lowest in the city to the highest in the city in terms of residential. People want to live there now. They spent $100 million in private money. Or how about in Seoul, Korea? The nastiest part of the city, the most smog-filled, they turned into this biophilic, beautiful park and river. So, in closing, we have to admit failure if we want to move forward. It's like alcoholism, right? You have to admit you have a problem or you can't fix it. It's the same thing here. We've made horrible planning mistakes that are bad for everything. They're bad for us and our health. They're bad for nature, big time. And they're really bad for business. And I'm a fiscal conservative, social liberal, and I can't understand how we can keep wasting money on this infrastructure that, by the way, we can't afford to maintain. And when it comes to all the technology and the autonomous vehicle, which I'm personally very excited about, I also recognize it's just one means to where we want to go. It's a tool, like all technology. And we already made this mistake with the automobile in the 1950s around the combustion engine. So the future is not around ownership, in my 2 cents. I think it's about access. And it's about mobility, proximity, and connectivity. And the cell phone has replaced a lot of the need for movement anyway. And the tried and true works. And I think we're going to be going back to a simpler life, which may surprise you with all this technology. But here's my thinking. So pre-industrial revolution, we didn't work like this. I mean, we worked on the farm to make food, but we didn't work jobs. And so again, we've been on the planet 200,000 years. We're gonna have all this technology automating the majority of jobs, including lawyer, doctor. And so we're gonna have a lot more time. And with this time, we'll probably be growing food in our neighborhood, spending time in our community, donating our skills to our neighbors, maybe bartering. It'll be more of an agrarian pre-industrial revolution type economy. If you want to go to Italy, you'll be able to jump on your AI headset and you can walk down the streets of Milan. You won't have to fly there necessarily. Business meetings will be conducted over Skype, much more advanced versions of Skype. And if businesses really want to be disruptive, they need to have more of a triple bottom line business model so that they can actually work with government. Because in the future, I think government and business are going to mesh much more closely. And we have to align our goals around the greater good, quality of service. You see Uber right now is in real trouble on a lot of levels. And Lyft is surging. And they've always kept their wits about them. And Uber has always tried to fight the government. Right? So you can sort of see how this story is going to play out. And data ultimately belongs to people that create it. And these big companies like Google and Cisco are going to have to recognize that. That's my daughter, by the way. That was her first pair of shoes that she bought. That was her enjoying the public space with her new pair of shoes. But, and this really is like my last slide, almost. There's one more. But we judge ourselves in America based on our output, our job title, our GDP for our country, right, our gross domestic product. And you look at some of these other countries that really base their report card more on how happy people are. So we are 18th, I think we're 14th to 18th, it depends on the year, Look at the infrastructure and the transportation, the public space in Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Canada, Finland, Netherlands, Sweden. There's a reason they're happier. There's a reason their health care costs half of what ours does, right? So maybe we should go a little bit beyond GDP and look at total happiness. And the fact is we have to. If we don't, not to end on a sour note, but if we don't, we're not going to have a place to live. Thank you. Out of time.
Thanks, Gabe. That was great. Let's take a 15-minute break, and we're going to return to this room at 3 o'clock for our next guest speaker, Dominique Dawes.
This I know.